Hello, Boulder Bookstore. My name is Corey Rosen. I'm here in beautiful San Francisco, California, and I am the author of the new book, Your Story, Well Told. So what inspired me to write this book was, it basically goes back to a March evening in 2013. I was sitting alone in a nightclub in San Francisco that had been converted for just one night into a kind of ad hoc story slam, where people put their names into the hat to be randomly selected. Only 10 people's names would be selected to tell true stories on a stage. It was the Moth, and it was the first time I'd ever been to a live Moth event. It was the first time one had ever been held in San Francisco, and I was a fan of the radio show. I was a fan of the podcast. I'm a fan of true storytelling, and I found myself with less than 24 hours to prepare, putting a story together and getting up on that stage when my name was drawn and telling my story. And I distinctly recall the change in that night from walking in there nervous and feeling kind of scared of going up on a stage, and I went alone, so I didn't know any of the other people there, many of whom seemed to all know each other. But from the moment I told my story, I felt connected to everybody in that room. People were turning around to me, telling me their stories. I was telling them more stories. And I really realized in that moment the power that true storytelling and sharing stories can have together. So over the span of the next few years, I became the host of The Moth, as well as an active improviser in the improv scene here in San Francisco. And I developed a curriculum that I've taught as a class for a number of years, and the class puts these two worlds and ideas together. The world of true storytelling, of taking stories from our own lives and telling them to complete strangers, and the world of improvisation, not in the comedy improv sense, but in the sense of being an improviser has to do with being present in the moment, to be creative and to be in reaction to the things that are naturally happening in your life and in your environment at the time. And so using the kind of tenets of improvisation and presence and positivity and narrative structures, I've developed a curriculum that I've put in writing. And it's what the context of the book is, because this book is called Your Story Well Told. So this is not a book of my stories. This is a book about how you could take any story from your life, find those stories, develop them, and then present or perform them. So my book breaks down the process into 3 steps. The process for developing a story in terms of like getting into your head and figuring out what are my stories, what are stories that I have, what's happened in my life. And not just anecdotes, but like which ones are stories? Like which ones would I want to develop as a story? We'll get into that in a second of what a story is. Secondly, how to actually structure and develop that. So it's not just like a thing that happened anecdotally, but it's got a beginning, middle, and end. There's some kind of a conclusion, something has changed at the end of the story. And then lastly, performing that story. And by performance, this book isn't just for people that are wanting to get up onto a stage and tell their stories. This could be for anyone who's maybe a business presentation, or maybe you have to give a speech at work, or a sermon, or you just like to read stories to your grandchildren or your children. It's putting those 3 phases together. And the way that I've broken it down, and the reason that I have, is that I've taken many students, hundreds of students, from this process in a matter of about 5 weeks in 5 classes, where we start with ideation exercises and games and activities that are written out in the book. Once we've selected a couple of stories that we like, then looking at different kinds of structures, so not just one kind of linear, but some non-linear, some different ways of telling narratives, and then crafting them into a performance, getting up on a stage, telling the story in a way that is authentic to you, whoever you are, so it doesn't feel like a memorized monologue and carry the artificiality of a memorized speech, but rather feels and retains the nature of it as a story that you are telling to an audience. Why do you think it's important for everyone to know how to tell a good story? Whew. I've heard a lot of really bad stories from people that I love. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or a knock against them as people. Not everybody can tell a good story. Maybe you've got some stories that you think are fascinating, things that have happened in your life. And when you tell them to other people, it ends up landing with that sort of you had to be there kind of feeling. I think understanding basic story structure, some basic storytelling principles, and this idea of understanding what can make something into a story. Like you've got something that's happened in your life, and understanding like I can actually take this occurrence, this moment in my life, and make a story out of it can be a really powerful tool. What is one weird thing people can do to help themselves tell stories better? Here's a weird thing that I do. If I have to give a presentation or a speech or perform in a show, I notice a lot of people do this. They'll have their story or their speech written out on a piece of paper, and they do this. They're kind of scanning and reading like they're cramming for a geometry test or something. They're just trying to memorize their story, and I see that backfire almost all the time. When people are trying to remember the words, they will get up on the stage, and a couple of sentences in, they're doing fine, and then their eyes go like this because they realize they forgot something or they forgot the next thing, and all of a sudden it gets weird for everybody. Everybody feels terrible for them because we know that they're trying really hard to be good, and we're catching them being not good. And we all know what it's like to fail. We all know what it's like to struggle or to not succeed. So in situations like that, or even better, I say don't put yourself into that situation, which is the idea that write your story down and then put it away. Don't look at it. Just be at the show and just in your head remember the moments or the beats or the sequence that you're going to tell, but not all the words that you're going to use. So that way when you actually get on that stage and you're telling it, it will come out naturally. It'll come out like you're telling it to the people that are right there rather than you're telling this imaginary literate version of what you've written out. It's the difference between an actor giving a performance and a storyteller speaking from their heart and from the things that are happening around them. The more present you can be where you are and with the people around you, the more you will engage your audience's interest, attention, and emotions to be there with you right then. One of the most common mistakes people make in their storytelling is they start their story too early. They start all the way back. I was a kid, I grew up in this town, and I had a best friend, and we would go play in the neighborhood, and we'd scrape our knees, and my dads were friends, and we would have backyard barbecue, and this has nothing to do with what the story is going to be about. So I would rather that people start their stories as close to the end of the story as possible. So I'm with Stuart Ames, and we're standing in the woods right off the fifth green of the country club, not far from his house. And Stuart's got a lighter in one hand and a bottle of bubbles in the other hand. This is a true thing that happened to me. So right away, we're curious about what's going to happen in the story. We're in the woods, we're near a golf course, we've got a lighter and a bottle of bubbles. What is the story about? Starting a story in the middle, in the action, creates interest, curiosity, and engagement for the audience. So then, if I wanted to back up and backfill things that people might need to know about the fact that Stuart and I are best friends, we've been best friends ever since third grade, and and he had just read a book about how to make a Molotov cocktail. Okay, now we've got backfilled information that's bringing us up to the curiosity of the moment of what's going to happen. Are they going to burn down the golf course? I hope that we hear a lot of pandemic stories. I feel like the pandemic is that rare moment in time where we've all been going through the same thing, and yet we've all been going through incredibly unique things at the same time. So whether you were all by yourself for long periods of time. I heard one person that I spoke to who hadn't touched another person for 4 or 5 months at the beginning of the pandemic. He hadn't made physical contact with another human. Or people who were all together in crowded, cramped spaces without enough room to do what they had to do. While maybe their kids were going to school in the bedroom and their wife was working from the living room and their other kid was in the hallway and they had to do all of their work calls from the stairs on the way down to the garage. That was their office. We're going to experience and have the opportunity to connect over those kinds of stories. So advice that I would have is, I guess advice I would give for any story, which is thinking about the things that make your story unique to you. What is the concrete, incredible details about your story that are your story, your experience? But also, what is the universal thing? What are the things that are going to connect your experience with the rest of us? So even though we weren't in your specific situation, we can hear your story, we can say, I know what it's like to need more space. Or, I know what it's like to long for the company of others. I think if we can kind of pull ourselves out of the moments of our own experiences to look at them from another point of view, this is like a camera zooming out, that we will understand and see that our experiences have a connection to others, and that the things that we learned or are learning through our pandemic experiences will even further help to connect us with each other when this pandemic is over. When I started writing a book about storytelling, the book's called Your Story Well Told, one of my first inclinations was to write my stories, to put my stories down and kind of just do a collection of my own stories. And what I realized as I started to do that was I found imperfections in my own stories. And rather than making it a laborious process of revising and editing and correcting those stories, I found a very teachable moment in that the process of telling a story and then revisiting and re-looking and examining that story itself is what goes on in the mind of someone who is developing a story to tell. So one of the things I hope people get out of reading this book is understanding that, yes, there are some very good stories in the book, but there are also processes that you can go through with your own stories so that you develop and understand that developing a story, developing the process is itself an organic process. That you need to start somewhere, you need to get something out. And then what you've got, you can build on that. You can find what is working about this. What do I like about this story? Why am I telling this story? What do I think this story is really about? And then as you start to go into the process of retelling or revising the story, you'll find that the story will change. The story will become more focused on one aspect than another, and you go through this really wonderful experience of discovering what the story really is. And that for me, I think is the gift, is not just to have stories to tell, but to have stories that are worth telling and to communicate your stories back to the world in the way that shares a piece of you with the rest of us. Because I really believe that a world where people are telling stories is a world where we are connected. We live in such an age where people are disconnected or can be disconnected on their computers or their mobile devices, headphones or earbuds in their ears all the time. When we slow down and we just talk to each other and tell stories, we feel connected in ways that keep us human and keep us alive. Would you read us a short passage from your book? I would love to. So, how do you end your story? When crafting an ending, my favorite place to look is backwards. What have we already established, introduced, and set up? Is there something that can be reincorporated, a line, a piece of advice you received? We will come into your story clean, and we will have little or no knowledge about you, your life, and your experience. Everything we know, we are learning from you. With this in mind, you have the power to direct our ending. With this in mind, you have the power to direct our knowledge and understanding of you. And you set us up for the ending. So lay in clues, motifs, and imagery that hold us through to the end. And when you succinctly leave us with that, with a memory, a message, you win a piece of our hearts. Another way to find your ending is to start with it. If you know where you want your story to end, the punchline, the shocking conclusion, and the lesson, then you can build the story backwards. Remember our story spine and the connection between every day and ever since that day. If you know the end of your stories ever since that day, then build up to that and reverse engineer the beginning to prepare us for that conclusion. Here's an example Randy Beard tells in this great story, In Need of an Ending. He begins with, I have two childhood memories of my mother. The first, I'm about 3 years old playing with her typewriter, and I get in trouble. The second, I'm walking with her to pick up my brother from church. I'm 5 years old, it's dusk, and we live less than a mile from the church. I remember the white line on the road next to me, my mom's hand in mine on my left side, and the headlights of a car behind us. Then I remember feeling the wind getting knocked out of me, like I was punched in the stomach. In the story, Randy recounts the confusing aftermath of the car accident, which ultimately reveals that his mother died that night. Dealing with the tragic aftermath of the incident, Randy is left with lingering, unanswered questions. People that don't believe he too was hit by a car. After all, wouldn't a 5-year-old have died if he was hit by the same car that killed his mom? But the lingering sense memory of getting punched in the stomach stays with him. Until one day, telling this story to a girlfriend, she suggests, did you ever consider that was your mother pushing you out of the way? He reconsiders the details of the memory, that when he came to, he was lying in the middle of the road while police lights flashed all around. And then Randy says, but I don't know how to end my story. How would you end this? The fruits of a good ending are usually born of seeds you planted early in the story. Sometimes they're hard to notice. In Randy's case, I think they're right there for the plucking. Look at his opening line. I have two childhood memories of my mother. This is a perfect opportunity to use this phrasing as a refrain with added impact, with a twist. Here's how I would end this story. Bringing back the phrasing from the opening with one major change. I have two childhood memories of my mother. The first, I'm about 3 years old playing with her typewriter and I get in trouble. The second is when my mother saved my life. Repeating a line, a phrase, a word, or bringing an idea back from somewhere else in the story gives us the full circle experience. Together we remember where we started, where we've been, and where we are now. Give your audience a final uplift, a swell of emotion, or a laugh, and you have a winner on your hands. What's more, by closing a story with this emotional beat, we will forgive the parts that perhaps were not quite as strong, funny, interesting, or concrete. Start strong and stick the landing, and you have the makings of a winning story.